Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna talk all about orchid media. We're gonna focus on the most popular orchid media on the market, but also on a few maybe not so conventional ones. We're gonna talk about mixes, what these media are good for, properties, and so on and so forth. Pretty much everything that's important for you to know about this media, because this will help you make a better decision based on your environment or your orchid. So with that said, let's start. We're gonna take these media one by one, talk about their properties and how to best take advantage of their properties. I think we should start with the most famous of them all, which is bark chips. Now, as the name suggests, the bark chips are actually shavings of the bark of a particular tree. In cultivation, we mainly use pine trees. Generally, bark is a non-water retentive material, which will not keep a lot of water around the roots of our orchid. It is also a rigid material which favorizes air pockets, making it a really good choice for epiphytic orchids. It is a very poorly absorbent material, and generally, when we want setups which have to be absorbent, we don't use bark, and it has a slightly acidic pH due to the quantity of tannins in its structure. I tested the bark that I used, and as you can see, we do have a slightly acidic pH. It's not very acidic, and the measurement actually falls in the good pH range that we want for our orchids. As most of you already know, most of the orchids in the flower shops actually come potted in bark, especially Phalaenopsis orchids, and this bark can have various sizes. What I'm showing you is a rather medium-sized bark. I find this size to work best for most orchids, even the ones with thin roots, even the ones with thicker roots, but on the market you will find finer bark than this, which is usually intended for orchid seedlings or orchids with very fine roots. You can also find bark which is much coarser than this, usually used with Cattleya orchids, Vanda orchids, orchids which generally like to have a lot of air around their root system. The size of the bark will determine the size of the air pockets. Therefore, smaller bark is generally used when we want a less aerated medium, maybe a more water retentive medium. This is good usually for seedlings, for Oncidium types and other orchids which really prefer to stay rather moist, or for orchids with very fine roots which generally will prefer to stay rather moist. And it's not preferred actually for something like Cattleyas or orchids with very thick roots. The thicker the root, the more space it will take in between the bark chips. And you can imagine that the air pockets will be filled with roots, so we won't have a great deal of ventilation if we are using small bark with thick-rooted orchids. Given that bark is not a very water-absorbent material, even if we're gonna use small-grade bark, we're still going to face one of the biggest downfalls of bark, and this is layering. If we look at this pot, we can clearly see that at the top, things are very dry, but at the bottom, things start to get quite a lot wetter. With full bark setups, layering is a very common problem, and it refers to the fact that water will indeed pool to the bottom of the pot while the top might get extremely dry. There are ways to avoid this or to actually minimize it. Slits or ventilation holes in the pots usually help. Mixes with other materials help as well, but we'll get to that. Just know that bark will always pool water at the bottom of the pot. So when you water orchids in full bark chips medium, you need to make sure that you drain them really well. You don't leave a pool of water in the dish because it will just not be absorbed upwards. You can have roots absorbing it, but some orchids really don't like to sit in water. Also, this bottom layer will actually degrade faster than the top, so it is in your best interest to minimize this layering effect by using mixes, ventilation slits, and so on and so forth. But it's not a problem in all setups. Let's imagine that this pot would be suspended, it would be kept hanging, you will have a lot of ventilation here at the bottom, so layering will most probably not be a problem in this type of setup. If you have an orchid which is potted and sits in a dish, then it will be a problem. So do adapt your setup according to this feature of bark. Just know it's not a deal breaker, it's not the end of the world, you can work around it, but you have to keep it in mind. A little side note, I do have a video in which I talk about a few tips to improve the setups in the mediums and overcome these cons of all media, so check it down below in the description. I do address the bottom layer being wet at all times and how you can actually go around it. Depending on how it's processed, bark can actually have multiple names and have different features. For example, this is your typical pine bark. It is not processed in a special way. It is the conventional or the standard bark chips, which will last you maybe about 2 years or 3 years, depending how wet the pot stays. But there are other types of bark on the market, such as Orchiata bark or kiwi bark, which don't come from different types of trees. It's still pine bark, but it is processed differently. Some substances are also added to maintain the pH more stable and overall make it more long-lasting. Orchiata and kiwi bark are generally more expensive than the conventional bark, and out of the bag they are very water repellent. Check the description down below. I do have a review on Orchiata and kiwi bark, so just know that it's perfectly normal for this medium to repel water. I suggest you actually soak orchids when you water them, at least for a while, until you get the bark just a little bit broken down. But on the opposite end, the less water retentive the medium is, the slower it will degrade. And bottom line, bark is the staple medium for orchids. No matter what type of orchid you have, you can actually grow it in bark. The only differences come in the way you have to maintain it. In some climates, such as cooler climates or maybe more humid climates, bark might be suited for things like Miltoniopsis or Oncidiums, orchids which generally prefer a lot of moisture, while in warmer climates or hot or dry climates, bark might actually be a hassle because it doesn't retain water, and in these climates we actually do want water retention. And for us, there is another very good and popular medium which we shall look at right now. Sphagnum moss, I believe, is the second most popular medium for orchids, and it's the medium of choice for very hot climates or for orchids which really like to stay moist, maybe even for seedlings or orchids potted in baskets. Sphagnum moss is, as the name suggests, a moss, and typically in cultivation we use the dried form. I am not 100% sure if this is processed in any way or simply dried, but when it is dry, moss can actually be used inside pots, inside baskets, just as a medium, and when it's alive and green, it can actually be used as a top layer on top of dried sphagnum moss. If we are dealing with a very tiny plant, then we can actually grow it directly in live sphagnum moss, but that's a whole different story. Moss is a very popular and I would say versatile medium. The main feature of sphagnum moss is that it is very water retentive, hence why people like to use it in hanging pots or baskets or even kokedama setups, and why it is so useful in very hot or very windy climates. Being that it's not a rough material, it is prone to compacting, but also to being easier to arrange inside the pot. But it's very easy to compact and suffocate orchid roots if we're not using the moss correctly. So from this point of view, it can actually retain lesser pockets than bark. The pH of sphagnum moss is actually more acidic than bark. It is verging on 4.8, as you can see, and with time and degradation it can even go lower. Sphagnum moss is the medium which degrades faster than all of these organic media, at least in theory, but good quality sphagnum moss can actually last you quite a long time. I think at least 2 years in a normal, let's say, drying up setup. Even so, it is still within good limits for our orchids, and some particular orchids actually prefer a rather acidic pH, such as the ones that live in symbiosis with ants. The Gongora, the Stanhopias, and the famous bucket orchid, the Coreanthus, are just a few of them. Sphagnum moss is also very water wicking. For this reason, it tends to stay rather evenly moist no matter how we water it, and unlike bark, it can actually be a much better option for those setups which are very prone to layering, setups which don't have ventilation slits, and generally setups which suffer from uneven drying. Being that it is so water retentive, obviously moss will not be the medium of choice for many environments. Cooler, more humid environments might actually not benefit at all from the use of sphagnum moss. However, in very hot climates or very breezy setups and environments, it's absolutely perfect. The problem with sphagnum moss is knowing how to work with it. I do have a video in which I elaborate a lot on how I like to use sphagnum moss as a soil medium, so I'll link you down below to it. The main idea is not to compact it. It is way too flexible for you to push it down inside the pot. This will just eliminate all of the air pockets and the roots might actually get suffocated. When I work with sphagnum moss, I usually purposely let air pockets in the pot. And as you can see in this example, the roots just filled all of the air pockets, and that's what I want. This is how roots are happier, not when the moss is very compacted. So with this technique, you can actually use sphagnum moss as a soil medium. No need for combinations with bark or other materials. But of course, you need to think about the environment and the orchid you're working with. Some orchids will simply not enjoy the constant moisture. Being that moss is so water absorbent, generally layering is never a problem because no matter where moisture is in the pot, it will always be evened out. So with orchids potted in sphagnum moss, we don't need to soak them. We can just run water through the pot or simply sit them a little bit in water and the sphagnum moss will start to absorb and distribute the moisture evenly throughout its mass. It is absolutely incredible from this point of view. No need for bottom layers or things of the sorts when you're dealing with sphagnum moss. There shall never be a pool of water in your dish as long as the moss is not saturated. If it's completely saturated, then yes, you will still have a little bit of water there, but as the water evaporates, you can rest assured that the moss will absorb it and distribute it very evenly throughout its mass. So bark and sphagnum moss are the most popular media, but they're also organic media, meaning they will need to be replaced every once in a while. Through their decomposition processes, they can actually start to damage the root system in time when they become sour, let's say. So people started to look into other alternatives. One of the most popular ones is clay medium. And here I have two representatives, which I think are the most popular. First, we have LECA, which stands for Lightweight Expanded Clay Aggregate. And then we have Ceramis, which looks and feels a lot like brick, but it's not really a brick. Now, as I was saying, these media are inorganic, and with this come a lot of benefits. First of all, they just don't decompose. So no matter how much you use them, how much you wet them, how many years you keep them and reuse them, they will not decompose. You can always sterilize them and reuse them. So they're very economical. Second, they are rough materials, so they're not prone to compacting, and because they don't decompose, they shall never compact. They will always maintain their shape. A little side note here, Ceramis is a rather weaker material. If you apply enough force, it will actually shatter and transform to dust. But I don't think anybody will start to step on this media, so theoretically they should maintain their shape intact no matter what for years. This will be great for orchids which really like air movement, air circulation, and you can rest assured that you will never have root suffocation due to LECA or Ceramis if you're using the adequate sizes. This can also be a drawback for orchids which really like to stay moist. The big air pockets might just be too airy for them. So definitely this type of medium is not really suited for all orchids in all environments, particularly hotter, more breezy, more dry environments, and all the setups that need a lot of moisture. Another super major drawback that I just had to discover after 2 years of using these materials: they're not acidic quite at all. Ceramis tends to stay rather neutral depending on what type of water you're using with your orchid, but LECA, at least the brands that I have here available to me, is incredibly alkaline. Its pH is somewhere above 8 even. And the worst part is, even if you prime it, it will still tend to go towards the alkaline side, because with orchids, we will always have drying out. I'll share with you down below an article which talks more about how to prime LECA using pH adjusting substances and so on and so forth. I have to tell you guys, I have tried all of these measures and I am not completely satisfied with the pH of LECA. It still goes rather alkaline because it never actually stays always completely moist. I can have moist LECA in the pot but dry LECA at the top, and that's enough to just alter my pH. And with an alkaline pH, some of my orchids are really suffering from small deficiencies. Some orchids which naturally like a rather acidic environment will simply just not do great. End of story. The oncidiums, which really like a lot of moisture, don't appreciate this medium because it's too airy and probably too alkaline. So I would say that the pH situation is the major drawback for LECA. But this can actually depend on the brand, and some orchids actually do really good in LECA. Cattleyas generally don't have a problem with LECA. I can see how they would like and they would enjoy the lower pH, so for this reason I am always preparing my water for them, always adjusting it, which is a headache, but it's something that I need to do. So some orchids will definitely react better to LECA than others, but I can assure you there are orchids which simply will refuse to adapt to LECA. However though, LECA does not decompose and you can always reuse it. So if that's a big enough incentive for you, then there you have it. I think you should definitely give it a go. The setup generally used with LECA is semi-hydroponics, and I do have quite a lot of videos on it. I'll list them all down below. I talk about the pros and cons, how to best use it, how to water it, and so on and so forth. So if you're interested, just check the description. And I would say that these are the major, most popular orchid media on the market. But there are a few others which I would just like to go through really fast. First off, charcoal, and I'm sure you cannot really see it. This is exactly what you think it is. It is charcoal, and it's a very popular medium mostly on the Asian continent. In Europe, and I believe even in the United States, it's really not as popular as bark. So at least in my region, I cannot find this for sale anywhere except if I want to get barbecue charcoal, but I don't really want to do that. The good thing about this medium is that it does not retain a lot of water, so in environments with very high humidity, it's actually a very good medium because it doesn't hold on to water. Also, it's charcoal, so it's not going to start and eliminate all sorts of degradation byproducts. Furthermore, it is said that it actually maintains medium and helps with odors. Being that I don't have extensive experience with this medium, I'm not going to insist on it, but just so you know, it is popular. Sometimes you will find it in mixes, very rarely depending on the region, but in some parts of the world, it is the most popular medium on the market. Then you have Rockwool, which is really not my preferred medium. This is an experiment, and by the look of the orchid you can tell that it didn't go so well. I do have some more videos on my experience with this medium, check them down below in the description. Rockwool generally is used with Phragmipedium orchids and sometimes only in combinations, not as a sole medium. I'm sure that some orchids can grow only in rockwool, and you might know already from hydroponics that seedling plugs can actually be made of rockwool. Just so you know, it's out there, some people use it. I just don't think it's as good as the other medium we just saw. Perlite and lava rock are generally used in mixes, not as standalone media, but I do know some people who use them standalone as well. Perlite is very light, so it's going to be very hard to make it sit in a pot without having some sort of other type of medium to hold it down. Lava rock is more popular in this regard because it is a pretty heavy rock. It can be used just as bark, and it is inorganic, so it will not decompose. It does have some harsh edges though, and I discovered that as a top layer it's not best for orchids with sensitive roots, with fine roots, but for vandas generally it can be used as a sort of medium just to retain a little bit of water around the root system, but definitely it is not a very water retentive medium. Coconut husk, whether the big chunks or the very fine material, the cocoa peat, is gaining popularity. I feel like the very fine one is the main medium of choice for nurseries nowadays. I'm not a big fan of this medium, but it is rather popular with nurseries and in some regions of the world. Check the description down below. I do have some videos, rather old videos, about using coconut husk and preparing it. The main problem with this material is that it can contain salt. Yes, because coconuts usually grow near seasides, and if it's not properly rinsed and washed, you can actually damage the root system due to the salt content. This is the main reason why I don't use it. I had some bad experiences with it, but in certain regions of the world, coconut husk, it is actually a very, very popular medium. It is more water retentive than bark, which is its main attraction, let's say. It is slightly acidic because it has a lot of tannins, but it can also have a lot of salt. So do watch that video. Try to make sure that if you want to use this medium, you buy from reputable brands, and if you don't, make sure that you rinse it for a week at least, and you change waters in the bucket every day. Just check the video, you'll understand what I mean. But now let's talk about my preferred way to use all of these media, mixes. Mixes can actually be used where bark or sphagnum moss or other media standalone simply don't work as great. But if we put them all together, they just make the perfect medium. There are many cases in which we conclude that bark is simply not wet enough, but full sphagnum moss is just way too wet, and we cannot actually use a very, very tiny amount or a very tiny pot because we have a big orchid. What do we do then when we want just a little bit more water retention, but we do actually really like bark? Simple, we make a mixture. And the ratios in which we will mix all of these elements will vary depending on environment and orchid. We can do 50-50 mixtures between bark and sphagnum moss, and that will make a airy medium that will retain a ton of water in comparison to a full bark medium. We can even go 70% bark and 30% sphagnum moss for just a little bit more moisture, or we can actually just use sphagnum moss and a little bit of LECA, a little bit of perlite, just to give more aeration and stabilize the pH. Because we're not only working with water absorption, air pockets, and things of the sorts, which are mechanical, let's say, we're also working with chemical things. Bark and sphagnum moss are acidic, and with time they will get more and more acidic, which will not be great for our orchid. Combining them with a little bit of perlite and of course with LECA will not only fill the medium and be more economical on the organic medium, but they will also maintain the pH a little further up. The range of pH we are looking for varies from 4.5 to 6.5. So within that range, we have a little bit of wiggle room. It is really important that our medium doesn't go below 4, let's say. That is when it will become pretty sour for our orchid, depending on the orchid. The addition of LECA will just make sure that this pH will not go below that as fast. It will maintain it on the upper side, maybe at a 6 value, which is just great. So we can definitely do all sorts of combinations with this medium to obtain something more or less water absorbent or water retentive, and also to adjust the pH. And the way we mix these materials will have to depend on our environment and of course the orchid we're working with. I don't believe there are any rules, just play with the mixes. See what works better for you, because in the end, you know best your environment, you're next to your orchid, and you can assess it every day. Don't worry if you make a mix and you will feel like it's retaining too much water. You can absolutely remix it and learn for the future. And I believe that's the fun of the orchid growing hobby. Not just seeing the orchids, but the maintenance part as well. Alrighty guys, so that's about it on the most popular media on the market. I hope this will be useful for you, and I hope you learned something new. And you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you'd like to support the channel, do consider visiting the merch store down below. So with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!